Hey, what's going on? Yes. We're going to do something a little different for the next couple of videos. It's a little different from the usual, the shenanigans, all that stuff like that. Yeah. For this video, we're going to discuss and roll about the Fifth Amendment self incrimination. Oh, yes. Here we go.
Good cops don't beat confessions out of people. But we all know of circumstances where some police officers in some circumstances have gone a bit too far, or maybe a lot too far, in trying to coerce a confession from people. And
Yeah.
this is
And here's the thing about the Fifth Amendment. The Fifth Amendment, when you're interrogated by the cops, or when you get arrested, they tell you you have the right to remain silent, and they'll tell you anything you say can will be used in a court of law. It is your right. Now, if a cop goes to ask you a question, you can sit there say, "I plead the Fifth," or you can sit there you can sit there say, "Well, excuse me, sir. I declined to answer that question," and they sit there say, "Why? Because I'm exercising my Fifth Amendment. I'm exercising my right to remain silent." Let's continue.
traditionally, at least, been such a significant problem that the founders, the framers of our Constitution, James Madison specifically, decided that they were going to prohibit this. And they were going to prohibit it by simply saying nobody can be compelled to testify against himself. And so the idea that you can beat a confession out of somebody, the idea that you can even engage in coercive tactics, the idea that you can even question somebody without first warning him that he has a right to remain silent, all of
Exactly.
those things have followed from the Fifth Amendment. And they are a protection against those sorts of very, very intrusive and very aggressive police tactics.
This was something that ran in the veins of everyone in colonial times because they all understood the importance of being able to keep private your thoughts and beliefs, especially on topics relating to your political views and your religious views, which
And
were
your
things
beliefs.
that people knew the King of England had a great interest in getting from his subjects, because if you had the wrong view on the proper allocation of power between the king and his subjects, or the wrong view on religion, things weren't going to go very well for you. And so the Fifth Amendment was one of the bedrock principles of English common law that was enshrined in the Constitution. And what it does is to set up a proper balance between the state and the individual about what the state can expect people to do by revealing their thoughts. What is it that you know? What is it you believe? What is it that you've seen? What is it that you remember? What is it that you're able to articulate? The government can't force you to reveal that to them because that robs you of the dignity that you deserve as an individual.
The Fifth Amendment is animated by a central predicate, and that central predicate is that there exists an inherently coercive environment when citizens are confronted by police. As a result, the Fifth Amendment erects certain safeguards to protect the interests of citizens, but also protect officers in the exercise of their duty.
The due process voluntariness test meant in the case of confessions arose in the 1930s in a case called Brown versus Mississippi. What happened in Brown is really instructive because it is one of the reminders that we haven't always had a history of law enforcement in this country of which we can be proud. Brown took place in a rural county in Mississippi, investigating the murder of a white farmer. The sheriff's department came to suspect a group of illiterate black farmers, and so they went to the home of
Almost
one
kind
of
of like
these
ties with LaVoy Finnegan.
suspects, and
LaVoy Finnegan
questioned
was a
him
farmer
about
himself
his
too.
involvement in the murder, and he denied having anything to do with it. So they tied a rope around the neck of this individual and put the other end of the rope over the branch of a tree and hold him up off his feet and hung him. And they let him down before he died, and they continued to question him, and he continued to deny having anything to do with the rape. So they strung him up again, and they strung him up again. Eventually they left. But they returned the next day, and they put him in a car, and they drove the car across the state line into Alabama, and they beat him. They took off his shirt, and they beat him, and they beat him, and they beat him. And eventually he confessed to the murder. So they put him in a jail cell. And the next day after that, they went to the two other suspects, who you could assume had learned what happened to the first person. And they brought those two other suspects back to the jail cell, and they took off their shirts, and they tied them over the top of a table. And the deputy sheriff, who had gone on the first excursion and had hung the first suspect from the branch of a tree, took off his belt, and with his buckle beat and beat and beat these two suspects until they also confessed. And they were put in a jail cell. And within a matter of about 7 days, they were tried, convicted, and sentenced to death.
Unreliability of confessions is so important, not only to citizens, but to police officers. The DNA revolution has taught us so very much. One of the biggest lessons we've learned from law enforcement use of DNA is that innocent people are in jail. DNA evidence have been used to exonerate innocent people. Now, these cases where people were exonerated leave a very distinct footprint in the sand. That is, when scholars do a root cause analysis, we see some similarities between cases in which people were ultimately vindicated by indisputable DNA evidence. And there are two classes of cases that keep coming up. One, eyewitness identification. We know now from DNA evidence cases that we don't witness things in the way that we think we do. Eyewitness identification is fairly unreliable. So identification evidence alone without other corroborative evidence is something that we should take a close look at. Second, confession. To most people, to most lay people, to most people outside of law enforcement, you think, well, why in the world would anyone confess to something that they didn't do? We now know from DNA cases that there are a lot of reasons why people confess. And a lot of people have confessed to things that they didn't do that DNA evidence absolutely excluded them from doing. So we know that there are innocent people in jail who've spent years, decades in jail before being freed from or by DNA evidence.
Ernesto Miranda was a defendant in a criminal case in Arizona. He was charged with rape. He was taken into custody, and he was questioned by Arizona police officers while he was alone in a police station for a lengthy period of time, and he eventually made a statement confessing to the rape. And when he was placed on trial, that confession was used as part of the evidence to convict him. And so the Supreme Court granted review of that conviction along with several other companion cases that all involved people who had been interrogated in the same kind of circumstances. And what the court did in this case was to make a paradigm shift, a shift in the essential way in which the court was going to view how the Constitution applied to the problem of police interrogation. Prior to Miranda, the court used as the primary lens through which to view this problem the Due Process Clause. And the Due Process Clause is also part of the Fifth Amendment, and it's part of the 14th Amendment, which makes it applicable to the states.
So the Miranda warnings are an important aspect of our criminal law. Anyone who's ever watched television knows what the Miranda warnings are. You have the right to be silent. You have a right to a lawyer. If you can't afford one, a lawyer will be given to you. If you give up your right to silence, then that can and will be used against you in court. The genesis of the Miranda doctrine came from a recognition that police custodial interrogation is inherently coercive. That is, most people, when they're encountered by police, feel a sense of coercion that sometimes will make them say or do things that they otherwise would not do. So Miranda is and was designed as a prophylactic safeguard to guard against this sort of
And sometimes when the police try to make you say things that you normally wouldn't say, or try to like coerce a confession on you, when the DNA is when it exonerate you, but the cops say, well, he said it, you confess to it. You know what those cops are, those cops are committing Brady violation, and that's when Brady violation comes into play for the Fifth Amendment and the 14th Amendment.
implicit coercion. Now, Miranda was not instituted on the notion that police officers were being purposefully coercive, but it was written from the perspective of the lay citizen that when someone approaches you and they have, a gun on their side and probably one in their sock and a big stick and mace and these sorts of things, that it's not unreasonable
And a taser, too,
for
as well.
people to feel some sense of apprehension. So the central tenet of confessions in the criminal justice system is that those confessions are reliable. And if we don't have reliable confessions, then we can't have any faith in the legitimacy of our system of punishment.
And that's the term called Brady violation, the Brady law.